Hello, this review is for a most excellent reread that I've just finished. It is Where Late the Sweet Bird Sang by Kate Wilhelm. Now, it's a reread because I did actually read this book years ago. I'm going to say probably in the 90s. And back then I had a very 80s edition. And funnily enough, I remember the cover of that edition even better than I remember the story. I remembered enjoying the story. I remembered that it was well written. I remember the vague themes of it and certain individual scenes, but the thing I really remembered was the cover, which was one of those 80s covers with the ruined, I'm going to say probably Washington in the background, and some girl with big bouffant 80s hair and what looked like shiny denim standing in the foreground. I didn't love that edition, and in one of the moves it left, not before I'd read it once or twice, but that was a long time ago and I'd largely forgotten the plot. Having given away my 80s version, I was more than ready to buy this beautiful old one. This is a 77 edition, I believe, from Pocket, which is an imprint of Simon & Schuster. It is beautiful. It's got beautiful artwork. It wraps around. I love the way you've got the background scenery, which is all atmospheric with that red sky, but then, I don't know if you can quite see it, the buildings are silvered. And it gives you a really good science fiction-y feel. I thoroughly enjoyed this book. And I went online to do a bit of research before I reviewed it. This research is largely based on Wikipedia, but I fell down a rabbit hole there because the Wikipedia entry was wrong on several counts, and I've edited one or two of them, and I'm wondering if I should just go through and redo the whole article, which is wrong in places. However, Kate Wilhelm was an American author. She died in 2018, by the way. And if you see that she was the wife of Damon Knight, like I did, and go, oh, that explains how she managed to be a well-known science fiction writer, like I did, you would be wrong. She started writing in the 50s. It wasn't until 62 that she divorced her husband, whose surname she bore, Wilhelm. And I think she remarried Damon Knight the next year. She was heavily influential in science fiction with Damon Knight, and he edited a lot of her work, but she was writing for a good decade or more before that. I am an omnivorous reader. I read lots of different stuff. She was an omnivorous writer. She wrote lots of different stuff. She wrote mystery, she wrote science fiction, she wrote a whole heap of other things. But for this book in particular, she won quite a few awards. I'm going to scroll down to where the award... all in 77 as far as I know, she won the Hugo Award for Best Novel. She won the Locus Award also for Best Novel and the Poll. She won the Jupiter Award, the John W. Campbell Memorial Award, 3rd place. And she was nominated for the Nebula Award, also in 1977, but lost out to Frederick Pohl. Now, not a huge shame in losing out to Frederick Pohl in that one, I'm going to say. Now, this book is a novel, and it had a history. So it's a novel in 3 parts. The first part is named after the title, Where Late the Sweet Bird Sang, which incidentally is a quote from that most quotable of authors, William Shakespeare. It's from one of his sonnets. I haven't really read his sonnets, so I don't recognise the reference, but so it is. The second part is called Shenandoah, and the third part, I had it here a second ago, is called At the Still Point. I don't always love people who split their novels up into those sorts of slices, but in this novel it works perfectly. So the first one, Where Late the Sweet Bird Sang, was originally a short story which was published in Orbit. Wilhelm published a lot in Orbit apparently, and that appeared in 1974 and copyrighted to Damon Knight. I guess that's something to do with Orbit, which was interesting. It was only a couple of years later, in 1976, it was copyrighted to Kate Wilhelm once it became a novel, and was published the year after. The 3 parts are very different, and they're different in good ways. don't believe a lot of what you see online. I read a lot of different things and I went, well, I think they misunderstood that quite significantly. That's both Goodreads and Wikipedia. The first part is common day, but it was her common day, not ours. So it's not 1920s, it's 1970s in feel. And the main character there is David. David is a small boy growing up in a very large extended family. So his mother and father live in this valley. We don't know exactly, we're never told exactly where it is. It might be Virginia. I think that's where Wilhelm lived. All we know about it is that there's a Shenandoah River and a Potomac River. And incidentally, reading it in 2024 with Google Maps made it so much more sense for me. I don't have good geography for the United States of America. All of my USA geography comes from science fiction, or at least 95% of it comes from science fiction. So reading this the first time around, I was pretty lost. This time Google Maps helped. Okay, so David grows up in this loving extended family, and he, in that first part of the book, he describes his childhood, picking blackberries in summer, getting blackened hands and faces, large family gatherings where all the aunts and uncles from the surrounding area came and stayed at the grandparents' house. Him and his cousins and his brothers and sisters all running wild. It all sounds very nice and very idealized, I guess, 50s through to 70s America. One of his uncles is a farmer, and he describes this love-hate relationship that he has with his cousin Celia throughout. When they were really young, they assumed they'd marry one day until it was explained to them that in this family, first cousins didn't marry, and then they became extremely argumentative, combatant even, non-friends for many years until they were older. But David grows up in this environment, and it's kind of cute, and he goes away to Harvard, and he's studying to be a scientist. He's kind of modeling himself after his Uncle Ben, who is a doctor, and I could be wrong about that, but he did have an Uncle Ben, and there was a doctor uncle. Anyway, after he comes back at 18, is it normal to go to university at 18 in America? I don't know, maybe he's just very smart. The first year he's at university, you guys call it college, but I don't. It doesn't come back for the first year. When he does come back, he's suddenly been admitted into that mystical adult circle. He's handed a martini before dinner, and they ask his opinion about the children, so he's kind of arrived at some goal. I think it's the next year that he graduates, and he's working on postgrad. When he's called to a family gathering with his grandfather, father, and uncles, where they say, we've donated this land up the hill behind grandparents' house, and we've got funding. We're going to build a hospital there, and that hospital is going to specialize in genetic diseases, and we want you to come and work in it. And he says, that's not my specialty. They said, you're going to come back because we've seen the writing on the wall, everything's falling down. If you read about the plot summary, everyone will go, oh, it's post-apocalyptic or post-Holocaust or whatever, and they'll do that really fast. But the beginning of this novel establishes very good characters, very good character background, a very strong emotive feel to the characters and their situation. And it does it well. So it doesn't start off bang in your nuclear rain falling from the sky. Instead, this one large family describes all the small things that are slowly accumulating. And in the 70s, I'm going to say that was a little bit prescient of Wilhelm, because that's how it's going. You've got small amounts of global warming, small amounts of diseases increasing, small amounts of this and that. And finally, it all gets to be too much. Now, when David goes back to uni, his uncle or his grandfather says you'll be back before the dogwoods bloom. I'm not sure what a dogwood is, but it sounds very pretty. And David is. And he comes back with all his equipment, all his knowledge, and he fully invests in the hospital to find out that not only is there the hospital, there's a whole underground cavern area, because his uncle the doctor has seen the lowering rates of fertility in both farm animals and in humans, and he's seen the higher levels of poisons and so forth. He started to clone animals, and he lets David in on the secret that he's allowing for the cloning of human beings if that ever becomes necessary. And in the first section it does. So I think we end the first section with them exposing to the rest of the family that they have already started cloning. Oh no, I was wrong. Still in this one, they do start cloning people. They start cloning babies when they realize that there isn't a single fertile woman in the whole valley, and there aren't any fertile men either. But by this point, their little community has become quite isolated, and I believe it's already starting to fight off incursions by roving gangs of marauders who are looking for food. They defend themselves, and of course, not even all the families seem to know about the underground facility. So they start cloning. Now, this book belonged well in our orbit because it goes a lot into the cloning, how cloning works, and the big problem that David and his uncles are trying to get around is the fact that cloning will work for 1, 2, 3, I think it's 4 generations, but fertility goes down, and they're trying to burst that fertility wall where they can clone and still have clones who are able to reproduce. There's a lot of pretty good science in there, and I think that's what attracted me to this book in the first time around. However, even though they haven't really broken through the fertility barrier, they do produce some fertile clones from every generation, and those fertile clones, while their fertility decreases as well, it's better than nothing, so they start doing it. The first generation clones come out, and they're cute little kids, but they're replicas of kids around. David's cloned. Celia, who's now back on the picture, and I won't talk about that, you can read it, is cloned. Ben is cloned. Various other people are cloned, so you've got these clone lines. And when they clone one child, they don't clone just one. I think they clone them in groups of 3 or 4. As these clones grow, and more successive generations come in, the clones start taking over the functioning of the community. At one stage there were 300 people living there, but it sunk to about 100 after the first wave of diseases and other contaminations and pollution and stuff. Now the clones are coming old, they're teaching the next generation of clones, and they're taking over all the laboratory and medical functions. And at some stage, David and a few of his uncles start to feel a bit threatened. And at a further stage, they all start to realize that the clones aren't exactly like normal people. I think they just thought they'd clone 5 of themselves, and those 5s would just react like normal children always had through the generations. But it's not a normal situation, and these aren't normal children. They slowly come to realize that there's, if not telepathic communication between them, at least empathic communication. An accident happens in the mill, for example, and the clones are there to rescue their brother before there's any chance to raise an outcry. And more ominously, they rescue the brother, but they don't rescue the old generation. So David starts to see the clones as a threat. Other people do, and it eventually comes to a head, and it has that old discussion that was very popular and interesting to people in the 70s and 60s. It's like, are clones really going to be human, or are they going to be a next step of human evolution, or are they going to be a totally different species? I mean, I'm basic biology in that sense. If you can breed and produce viable offspring, then you're the same species. However, this is a debate that, if you are interested in, very much and very subtly is done in Where Late the Sweet Bird Sang. So, the end of part 1 is, after numerous attempts to sabotage the cloning, David is exiled from the community, and we start the next part with Molly. Molly is a protagonist who is part of a clone group of clone group of 6, they're known as the Miriam sisters. At this point, we're not getting over-explained how the cloning works, only that it does. So Miriam is the oldest sister. There's 6 of them in total, all with names beginning with M. And this chapter 10 starts describing the society that the clones have, where these brother groups and sister groups have evolved a whole different society. They have a level of promiscuity that would have been startling to people in the 70s. They have a level of codependence that would be alarming to anyone who cares about individuality. But they don't care about individuality. In the first section, there's this bit where one of the clones and David are having this head-to-head about it. And David's saying you can't get rid of all individuality. And the clone says, well, why not? It hasn't worked that well for you. This clone society is based on groups. If a member of the group dies or leaves, they have a parting ceremony, and that group reconsolidates without the one that's left. It's very, in some ways, kind of almost socialist in its perspective. It's like the good of the community over the good of the individual, and they don't really value an individual at all as such. They only value the clone groups. And this is a problem because they're running out of a whole heap of supplies for their cloning, and they want more information. So they're sending an expedition down to, I'm going to say, Washington. Now, Lewis from an L group of clones, I don't know, has devised a boat, and a group of 6 are going to get in it, travel down the Shenandoah, travel down the Potomac, thank God Google Maps was there, and go to Washington and try to find resources that the community desperately needs. What none of them foresaw was how terrible an effect this would be on all these individual clones. Even though they're traveling in a group of 6, each one of them is traveling without any of their clone brothers, or in Molly's case, sisters. And it leaves deep psychological scars on all of them in one way or another. This trip is beautiful. Wilhelm describes this travel down the river, the forests. She doesn't describe a post-apocalyptic scenario so much in terms of forests and vegetation, though she does when you reach a city. I'm talking too extensively here for anything that YouTube's going to approve of. Really like the second section. Molly comes back. Molly comes back and she can't reintegrate with her sisters. And eventually she ends up because she's causing them so much distress, she ends up being exiled to the old Sumner house down the valley where she lives peacefully on her own. During this part of the book as well, we find out that the older generation expected the people who were reproductively fertile and able to breed to be revered by their clone brothers. Far from it. They've been isolated, they're kept virtual prisoners, they are hypnotized so they can't leave their dwelling, they are chemically controlled because they miss their brothers and they miss their sisters. There's a strong but subtle theme about women losing their reproductive autonomy in this book, much as there would be in Atwood, but it's not a focus for Wilhelm. So this is a fate that no clone wants, and Molly lives on her own in the old house painting pictures, but she also enters into a relationship with Ben, who was the doctor on the trip down the Shenandoah. And as Ben hasn't reintegrated, eventually he ends up going on another trip where he's going to stay down there, and Molly finds out that she's pregnant. Don't believe Wikipedia when it says that Ben helps her give birth. She does it all on her own. And then she names her child Mark, and she manages to hide him, I think it's for 6 or 7 years, from the community before they're discovered. At this point, Mark is forcibly integrated into the clone community, and Molly is taken off to be a breeder. She eventually manages to break the programming and escape down the river. She's going to look for Ben, but before that, she meets up with Mark and tells him he has to stay until he grows to be a man and learns everything that he needs to learn. And that takes us to part 3, in which we see Mark growing up in this community, which is terribly, terribly isolating for him. The clones don't want to play with him. They don't want anything to do with him. They think he's weird. But the older clones want him around. They think they can learn things from him about psychology, and he knows the woods. The community desperately needs to acquire things from the old cities, and they need to explore, and they don't have the capacity to deal with woods. They don't have the capacity to go off on their own, and it's rapidly becoming clear that things that Mark can learn, the clones can't. So they keep him around. It's pretty horrible for him. I think we first start with section 3, when he's pranking clone brothers and drawing numbers on them, and when he's asked why, he says, so I can tell them apart. He has an unpleasant life, but he manages to make it through. So the way the clones punish bad clones is to put them in isolation. Mark doesn't mind, he loves isolation. He just doesn't like being around the clones that much. Eventually they manage to find a way to punish him, which is to keep him always with other people, and they use him for expeditions, which he's happy to do. And there's a final expedition all the way down where he discovers that the winters are returning. Over time we have various, I think it's Barry is the main clone who has much to do with Mark. He's one of Ben's brothers. After Ben was sent down south, they had a breaking ceremony, and now they're a clone group without Ben. But he has a lot to do with Mark. So he's allowed to live in the village as an individual. My understanding is, and Wilhelm isn't clear on this, is that when a reproductively fertile female produces a baby, that baby is then cloned, so they're in a group. And I think that's why Miriam in Molly's group is a couple of years older than all the rest of them. And in other groups you will also have one that was the first of the clones. Not spelled out, but that's how I understand it to be. Where was I when I diverted there? Okay, so we see the world with Mark, and it's interesting. Barry has made references to the winters getting harder and longer and the snow coming heavier and sooner. But on one of his expeditions, Mark sees a glacier approaching, and we, the readers, know that glaciation is happening. Going back to the community, Mark finds that one of the other clone teams wants to kill him. They basically do get rid of any clone that is abnormal and is affecting the community. They want to do that to him. Before that can happen, he starts sabotaging some of the clones' work, and we find that the multi-generational cloning is having effects. Mark follows his mother in being an artist. Molly was a painter, he's a sculptor. He can see things, and there's a chilling scene toward the end of the novel where Mark makes this snowman, and it's a beautiful sculpture. And Barry looks at it and he's amazed by his artistry, but one of the baby clones, one of the newest of the clone groups, can't see that it's a man. They can only see a pillar of snow. And that's when they realize that the newer clone groups have no artistry. They have no ability to draw, no ability to do maps. They can learn anything that they're taught, but they can't create. As the cloning lines are coming to a bit of an end, another clone, I think it's Lawrence, proposes a completely radical departure, which is basically to make clones that are basically worker bees. And since they're running out of equipment or the ability to get more equipment, what they want to do is they want to start implanting them in fertile females. So instead of having babies, they're just going to be baby machines, producing maybe sometimes triplets even of these worker ants. Before this happens, Mark escapes. He manages to liberate, much against their will, some of the breeding females and some of the farm animals, also cloned, but you know. And he escapes to found a community outside the village. He comes back to visit it, I think it's 20 years later, to see that the clone community is completely fallen down, and that him and his genetically diverse, sexually reproducing colony are now the inheritance of mankind. That's probably spoilers, but it's from 77, for goodness sake. It's a really, really good book. It's got strong science fiction themes all over. It's got strong sociological themes all over. It's got great characters. The narrative progresses beautifully. The plot is quite amazing. And yeah, so I've talked longer than I would normally about a book, but there's so much to share and enjoy about this book. I would thoroughly recommend it if you're into old classic science fiction and you haven't read it yet. There's a lot of audiobooks out there as well, so for those who specialize in audiobooks, I don't know what their narrators are like, but there's many opportunities for you to listen to this, even if you can't personally read it. And I would, if you liked Atwood and her examination of social situations and social female autonomy, then I think you'll find some parts in here very interesting. But overall, I think it's a better book because you've got more characters, you've got more happening, and you've got less. It's just a more rounded plot overall. That's all I can say. Okay, thank you for watching. This is a rather long one, but there's a lot to say. And have a great day. Read good books. By all means, read this very, very good book, Where Late the Sweet Bird Sang by Kate Wilhelm.